When and where can we most easily meet the Lord? In today's readings, God tells us the time and the place where we are to worship Him and to meet Jesus in the Eucharist. So first, the time most appropriate to worship God is the Sabbath day. The third of the Ten Commandments, that's enumerated in the first reading today, tells us to keep holy the Sabbath day. For the Jews, the Sabbath was Saturday, since this was the day that God rested from all His work in creating the world. 6 days you may labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is the Sabbath day of the Lord, your God. No work may be done. In 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but on the seventh day He rested. This is why the Lord has blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. That's what it says in the Scriptures. So for us as Christians, our Sabbath is actually now Sunday. It's the Lord's day, the day that Jesus rose from the dead, the day He opened up heaven for us, our eternal rest. It's been transferred from Saturday to Sunday by the resurrection of Jesus. And there are two aspects for keeping holy the Lord's day. First, we are obliged to attend the holy sacrifice of the Mass, either on the day or on the vigil. And secondarily, we're also to rest from unnecessary work. And our world around us has lost much of both of these aspects. Culturally, we still have the weekend, but Saturday and Sunday are often seen as days for myself, rather than the rest and time that we should give to the Lord. And perhaps certain employers also don't respect their employees' needs for rest and worship on the Lord's day. And it can be a temptation for any of us not to rest, because there's just so much that we must do. Speaking of so much that we have to do, isn't it true, Father, that if we have other things we need to do, it's okay not to go to Mass on the weekend? If we got a sporting event, we got something else more important, then we can miss, right? Nope, that's not a thing. You still have to go. That's not an excuse for not being able to go. Well, what about traveling when on vacation? Certainly God allows us to take a vacation from having to go to Mass. No, that's actually not a thing either. We are to try our best to be able to go to Mass, and almost everywhere we go in the world, there's an opportunity where we can. The way in which we can evaluate ourselves as to whether or not we're risking mortal sin by missing Mass is, am I missing it? Do I want to go? Would I go even though maybe in this circumstance I'm unable to? Versus, I'm using this as a convenient excuse to not really look into it at all and not have to go into it. And then we're probably risking our relationship with the Lord if that's our interior attitude. So anyway, to rest on the Sabbath, to waste time with God in prayer, seems to be foolishness to the world around us. But as St. Paul says in the second reading, the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. God's laws are not given to us as burdens. Sometimes we think that's how His laws are. I can't do this, I have to do that. They're a burden upon us. But that's not true. They're given to us to refresh us, as it says in the responsorial psalm. The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. We need to be refreshed from all of our labors that we do throughout the week. And that's what the Sabbath day is given to us for. We need it. Of course, the Sabbath rest doesn't prevent us from excluding doing good. That was what Jesus had to explain to the Pharisees who tried to prevent Him from doing His acts of mercy, His miracles to those in need on the Sabbath. Jesus explained to them that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath was indeed made so that we could be refreshed, that we would have rest. We need to be filled with God's life every week so that we can go forth into the good things that He asks of us. But it's meant to assist us in doing good. And so while we have to refrain from most labors on Sunday, we certainly can and should perform acts of mercy toward our neighbors. There's a balance that we have to find there. We must not use prayer as an excuse to not do the good that we should do for others, nor can we simply say on the opposite end, well, my work's my prayer, and then not pray. You have to balance both of them. to keep the commandments, we have to do both of those in their proper time and place. So the Sabbath, Sunday, is the time that God has given to us to worship him and to meet Jesus in the Eucharist at the weekend Mass. So then the question is, where do we do it? So the second thing we learn in our readings is the place most appropriate to worship God. And that is the temple of Jesus' body. Let me explain. In the Gospel, Jesus comes to the temple in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And there, Jesus, upon seeing his Father's house and how it was being treated, in righteous anger, he overturns the tables, he drives out the money changers. Take these out of here and stop making my Father's house a marketplace. You see, for the Jews, the only place that they were to worship and offer sacrifice to God was the temple in Jerusalem. There was no other place they were allowed to offer sacrifices. This was the place where God's presence was with them. Originally, the temple in the Holy of Holies was housed the Ark of the Covenant, the golden box. And inside that was the Ten Commandments, we heard in the first reading. Also some of the manna, that miraculous bread they ate in the desert. And also the staff of Aaron, the very first high priest of the people. Unfortunately, that Ark of Covenant was lost right before the time of the exile, centuries before Jesus' coming, so that when Jesus came to the temple, the Holy of Holies was empty. The Ark of the Covenant wasn't there. And so in a sense, with Jesus coming to the temple, it was the presence of God returning where it was meant to be, returning into the midst of God's people. And also, just like we saw with Jesus' coming, the time for worship changed from Saturday to now Sunday as the appropriate Sabbath. So too did the place change from the temple in Jerusalem to the temple of Jesus' body. When Jesus was talking to them, we heard that Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." But Jesus wasn't speaking about the temple there in Jerusalem. He was speaking about himself. Destroy this temple through the crucifixion. 3 days, I will raise up my body from the dead in the resurrection. And so the temple of God, where we're to worship today, is now wherever the temple of Jesus' body is. And our temples, our churches today, has a new golden box. And this golden box, like the Ark of the Covenant of old, contains now the law of God, not on stone, but now written in flesh, Jesus himself. No longer the manna in the desert, but now the bread of life. No longer the staff of Aaron, the high priest, but now the high priest, Jesus Christ himself, his real presence in the Eucharist. So wherever Jesus' real presence is in the Eucharist, that is where we gather and that is where we worship. And just as Jesus drove out irreverent actions from the Jerusalem temple, so too we must be careful to make sure that we remove all irreverent actions from our temple, our church building as well. During Mass, that's why we're especially maintain an attentive quiet as our focus is on God who dwells here in our midst. But also before and after Mass, we do the same thing. The presence of Jesus is here. He remains here in the tabernacle. And so we want to be sure that we treat the church as truly what it is, as the Father's house, as a house of prayer. And so our conversations before Mass, most appropriately should occur outside the nave and the sanctuary, so we can allow those who may still wish to pray. But I know that many of our churches, like here at St. Paul's, we don't have a lot of room in the entryway to be able to do that. So we want to make sure that, if we're conversing with one another, I don't want to stop us from doing that, but we need to make sure that we are never forgetting whose presence we remain in and, maybe sometimes have to temper our conversations. Second, we can't use the sacred space of God's temple for other things. So we don't use the church space for things like entertainment, showing ourselves off for others. The sanctuary to some people might look like a stage, but it is not a stage. It is the Holy of Holies in the temple where Jesus' presence is here with us. And we have halls and auditoriums to do all those other kinds of events. but this space here is reserved for the worship of God alone. We cannot turn our church into a marketplace. Finally, as a house of prayer for all peoples to encounter Jesus, we need to be welcoming and inviting to all who come. As we share priests and our Mass times, that means we have more parishes with fuller churches. And that means we shouldn't get upset if we find a visitor happen to sit in our spot. Right? Because we want to remember, it's not your church. It's not just your church. It's Jesus' church. It's the Father's house. It's a house of prayer for all people. Right? Sitting in a slightly different spot at times will not kill us. Our church attendance, as it dwindled in the past, it kind of got us into the habit of kind of spreading out and taking up our space. Maybe even sometimes guarding the end of the pew, even if there's a lot of extra room still in there. And so that's one of the things we need to watch out too, is that the church sometimes isn't as full as we think it is. There's actually spaces and room for our neighbor. And it can actually be an act of charity in a full Mass to move over into the center of the pew so that someone can be able to find a spot for them to sit in the ends. So let's let our parishes be the house of prayer, not just for ourselves, but for all people who may show up, and cheerfully make room for others. In today's readings, God tells us the time and the place that we're to worship Him. The time on Sunday, the Lord's Day, and the place, His temple, the church, where we find the temple of Jesus' body and blood in the Eucharist.